A firefighter risked his own life to save the family dog from a burning house, but the owner's reaction left the entire neighborhood completely shocked. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Mike Reynolds wiped the soot from his face, his weathered skin glistening with sweat as he stared at the inferno consuming Eleanor Parker's Victorian home. The crackling flames painted the night in angry oranges and reds, devouring the old wooden structure with insatiable hunger. 30 years as a firefighter, and still, the raw power of fire never ceased to humble him. His radio crackled. "Reynolds, get out now! The structure is compromised. I repeat, evacuate immediately." Chief Donovan's voice was sharp, commanding. Mike's hand moved to his helmet, fingers brushing against the laminated photo tucked inside. Him and Frank, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning widely after a difficult rescue 5 years ago, before everything went wrong. "Reynolds, do you copy?" The desperation in the chief's voice cut through his momentary distraction. "Copy that," Mike responded, backing away from the porch steps, his eyes still fixed on the second-floor windows where flames licked at vintage curtains. As he retreated toward the safety perimeter, a frail hand clutched his arm with surprising strength. Mrs. Parker, wrapped in an emergency blanket, her silver hair disheveled and face streaked with ash, looked up at him with pleading eyes. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's still inside. Second floor, my bedroom." Her fingers dug deeper into his arm. "Please, he's all I have left." Mike felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the smoke he'd inhaled. The small terrier, he'd seen pictures of him on the mantelpiece when they'd first entered the house. Before the east wing collapsed, and they were ordered to retreat. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he said, the words like ash in his mouth. "The structure isn't safe anymore." "Please," she repeated, something breaking in her watery blue eyes. "He's just a little dog. He'll be so scared." The radio crackled again. "Reynolds, confirm your position outside the structure." Mike looked from the desperate woman to the burning house, then back at the command center where Chief Donovan stood watching him, jaw set in grim determination. In 3 months, Mike would be retiring after 3 decades of service. 3 months to a pension, to safety, to finally leaving behind the nightmares that had plagued him since Frank died. But those eyes, Mrs. Parker's eyes, held the same desperate plea he'd seen in too many victims' faces throughout his career, the same plea he'd seen in his own reflection for 5 years. "I'm going back in," he muttered, more to himself than to his radio. He turned toward the house when a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. Chief Donovan had approached, his face a mask of fury and concern. "Don't even think about it, Reynolds," Donovan growled. "The second floor could collapse any minute." "There's a dog trapped upstairs," Mike explained, shrugging off the chief's hand. "And I've got a firefighter who needs to remember his training," Donovan countered. "We've cleared the house of human life. Protocol is clear." Mike's jaw tightened. "Frank would have gone back." The chief's face softened momentarily. "Frank isn't here anymore, Mike. And throwing your life away won't bring him back." The words cut deep, but instead of deterring him, they solidified Mike's resolve. He saw Frank again in his mind's eye, disappearing down that smoke-filled hallway, turning back one last time with a confident nod before the ceiling came down between them. "I still have time," Mike said, stepping back from the chief. "That's an order, Reynolds. Stand down." Donovan was shouting now, reaching for Mike's arm. In one fluid motion born from years of instinct, Mike pushed past the chief, knocking him off. Balance. Several firefighters moved to intercept him, but he'd already broken into a run. "Reynolds." The furious shout followed him as he sprinted toward the burning structure, oxygen mask back in place. The heat hit him like a wall as he re-entered through the front door. The once elegant entryway was now an apocalyptic vision of fallen beams and dancing flames. The grand staircase still stood, though barely, flames eating away at its ornate banister. "Buddy!" Mike called out, knowing the dog couldn't possibly hear him over the roar of the fire, but needing to fill the oppressive heat with something other than the memory of Frank's last moments. He navigated the ground floor carefully, years of experience guiding his steps across compromised flooring. The formal dining room was entirely engulfed, and as he passed its arched entrance, a thunderous crack split the air. Mike dove forward just as part of the ceiling collapsed behind him, sending a shower of embers and flaming debris across his path, effectively cutting off his retreat. Pain lanced through his left shoulder as a falling beam grazed him. He gritted his teeth, pushing himself back to his feet. No way out but forward now. The stairs groaned ominously under his weight. Every step was a gamble, the wood weakened by the heat and the water from earlier firefighting efforts. His radio emitted nothing but static, the thick walls and interference from the fire cutting him off from communication. "Buddy," he called again as he reached the landing, the smoke thicker here, rolling along the ceiling in black waves. The heat was nearly unbearable, even through his protective gear. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. The hallway stretched before him, doorways yawning like portals to hell itself. Which one was Mrs. Parker's bedroom? He tried to recall the floor plan they'd reviewed before entering the first time. Master bedroom, east side facing the garden. Mike moved cautiously down the hall, the floorboards, protesting beneath his boots. A sharp crack from below reminded him of how little time he had. The entire structure was a death trap, moments away from total collapse. As he reached what he believed was the master bedroom, a faint sound caught his attention, barely perceptible beneath the fire's roar. A whimper so soft, he might have imagined it. "Buddy!" he called, dropping to his knees to scan under furniture. There, beneath the large four-poster bed, a small shape huddled against the wall. Mike reached under, feeling soft fur against his gloved hand. The terrier was unmoving, likely unconscious from smoke inhalation. "I got you, buddy," Mike whispered, carefully pulling the small dog out and cradling him against his chest. The animal's breathing was shallow, but present. "Let's get you out of here." He tucked the dog securely inside his coat, close to his body heat but protected from the direct flames, and turned back toward the hallway. The smoke was now so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead. Frank's voice seemed to echo in his memory. "Always have an exit strategy, Mikey. Always." Mike moved as quickly as he dared back toward the stairs, one hand steadying himself against the wall, the other holding Buddy secure against his chest. The little dog's warmth was reassuring, a reminder of why he'd risked everything to come back in. As he approached the top of the staircase, a new sound rose above the fire's roar. A deep, structural groan that every firefighter learns to fear. Mike lunged forward, reaching the landing just as a series of sharp cracks split the air. The floor beneath the staircase buckled. In horrifying slow motion, the grand staircase that had stood for over a century tore away from the second floor, collapsing into the inferno below in a shower of sparks and flaming debris. Mike staggered back from the edge, clutching Buddy tighter as the reality of their situation became clear. Where the staircase had been, there was now only a gaping hole, leading straight down into a sea of flames. He stared into the void where their escape route had been, holding the unconscious dog against his chest, the weight of his decision pressing down on him harder than the smoke-filled air. They were trapped on the second floor, with the fire advancing relentlessly toward them. Mike stared at the void where the staircase had once been, cradling Buddy against his chest. The little terrier's weight felt almost non-existent compared to the crushing realization that their primary escape route had vanished. Flames danced in the chasm below, mocking his decision to return. "Reynolds, report your position!" His radio sputtered back to life momentarily, Chief Donovan's voice cutting through static. "The building's integrity is compromised. You have less than 3 minutes before total collapse." 3 minutes. The words hit Mike like a physical blow. He'd faced tight situations throughout his career, but this, Trapped on a crumbling second floor with an unconscious dog and a failing structure, this was pushing the limits of even his experience. A weak cough from inside his jacket refocused his attention. Buddy was stirring slightly, his small body convulsing with the effort to expel smoke from his lungs. The dog's eyes remained closed, but the labored breathing was growing more erratic. "Hang in there, little guy," Mike murmured, quickly assessing their options. With practiced movements, Mike removed his oxygen mask and carefully placed it over Buddy's muzzle, holding it there for several seconds, then taking a breath himself before returning it to the dog. The improvised shared breathing was far from ideal, but it might buy them both precious time. "Think, Reynolds. Think," he muttered to himself, scanning the hallway in both directions. The master bedroom he'd just exited was already half consumed by flames. The opposite end of the hallway led to what he recalled from the building plans as a guest bedroom and bathroom, possibly, offering alternative exits. Mike moved as quickly as the unstable flooring would allow, testing each step before committing his full weight. The smoke was thickening by the second, forcing him to crouch lower. Even with his extensive training and equipment, each breath was becoming more painful. As he reached the guest bedroom door, a sharp crack beneath his right foot sent adrenaline surging through his system. The floorboard gave way, his boot plunging through the weakened wood. Mike threw himself sideways, crashing against the wall as more of the floor crumbled away, revealing the inferno raging below. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the hole he'd nearly fallen through. One more step, and both he and Buddy would have plummeted to the first floor. The new opening in the floor created a chimney effect, drawing more smoke and heat up around him. Mike crawled the remaining distance to the guest bedroom, pushing the door open with his shoulder. As he entered the room, the world around him blurred. The guest bedroom transformed before his eyes, not into another part of Mrs. Parker's Victorian home, but into the hallway of Westridge apartment complex where he'd lost Frank. "Mike, there's still someone on the third floor." Frank's voice echoed in his mind, as vivid as if his friend were standing beside him. "The structure's failing, Frank. Wait for backup." His own voice, 5 years younger, pleaded in his memory. "No time. I can make it." Frank adjusting his mask, that confident nod. "Cover me." Mike blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. The flashback had been so vivid he could smell the specific chemical odor of the apartment fire mixed with the current blaze. His hands trembled, not from the heat or exertion, but from the paralyzing weight of memory. "Not now," he whispered, pressing his back against the wall and focusing on Buddy's weight against his chest. "Not now." The trembling in his limbs intensified. For the first time in his 30-year career, Mike felt true panic taking hold. Not the controlled, professional concern he'd managed throughout countless emergencies, but raw, primal fear that threatened to root him in place until the flames claimed them both. One step at a time, he forced himself to speak aloud, the training mantra cutting through the panic. Assess, decide, act. The guest bedroom offered little hope. Its windows faced the front of the house where the fire had originated, and flames were already licking at the frames. No viable exit there. Fighting back against the encroaching memories and the growing sense of doom, Mike pushed himself forward, checking the ensuite bathroom. Its small window might be their last chance, but reaching it would mean crossing more compromised flooring. With no better options, Mike retreated into the hallway, heading toward Mrs. Parker's bedroom once more. If nothing else, its windows overlooked the garden at the back of the property, potentially offering their best chance for rescue. As he re-entered the master bedroom, the destruction was even more advanced than minutes before. The antique dresser was fully ablaze, and half the ceiling had collapsed onto the four-poster bed. The increasing heat forced Mike to stay low, crawling along the periphery of the room. Something caught his eye as he passed a partially open drawer that had fallen from the dresser, old photographs spilling onto the floor, and among them, a military medal in a tarnished case. The metal looked oddly familiar, stirring a distant memory that he couldn't quite place. There was no time to investigate. Mike continued toward the windows, noting with growing concern that Buddy's movements had become increasingly feeble. The dog's breath came in shallow gasps, even with the intermittent help from Mike's oxygen mask. "Just a little longer," Mike urged, both to Buddy and himself. He reached the windows only to find the first one stuck firmly in its frame, swollen from heat and decades of paint. The second was partially melted around its edges. A third, door-like window appeared to lead to some kind of balcony or exterior access, but it was blocked by a heavy wardrobe that had fallen against it. Mike positioned Buddy safely in a corner with the least smoke, then braced himself against the wardrobe. With a grunt of effort, he pushed against it, feeling pain lance through his injured shoulder. The massive piece of furniture barely moved. Taking a deep breath of the thinning, good air near the floor, Mike stood and threw his full weight against the wardrobe. Pain exploded across his back as the burning wood made contact with his protective gear, the heat penetrating to the skin beneath. The wardrobe shifted slightly, revealing the outline of a door beyond. Gritting his teeth through the pain, Mike rammed the obstacle again. This time, the wardrobe toppled sideways with a crash, exposing a narrow door that indeed led to a small balcony. Hope surged as Mike gathered Buddy back into his arms and pushed through the door. The rush of relatively fresh air was both relief and shock to his smoke-irritated lungs. He coughed violently, nearly doubling over as his body tried to expel the toxins he'd inhaled. The balcony was small, barely 3 feet square, its wrought iron railings ornate but aged. Below, firefighters worked to control the blaze from the exterior, unaware of his emergence. The drop to the garden below was at least 25 feet, survivable perhaps for him with proper technique, but likely fatal for the small, already weakened dog. "Chief Donovan," Mike called down, his voice raspy from smoke and barely audible over the roar of the fire. "Second floor balcony." No one looked up. The firefighter's focus remained on the main blaze, the noise of equipment and the fire itself drowning out his calls. Mike reached for his radio again, but received only static in response. The batteries were failing, or the internal components had been damaged by heat. Buddy had gone completely still in his arms, no longer coughing or struggling for breath. Mike checked the dog's chest, feeling for the slight rise and fall that would indicate life. It was there, but barely perceptible. The small creature was losing his fight. "Not like this," Mike whispered, desperation mounting. He had survived countless dangerous situations throughout his career, saved dozens of lives, and yet here he was, about to fail when it mattered most personally. He assessed the distance to the ground again, calculating the risks. If he jumped and managed to land properly, he might survive with broken bones. Buddy, however, would almost certainly be crushed by the impact or by Mike's weight. If he tried to throw the dog to someone below first, the small animal might suffer internal injuries that would kill him anyway. As Mike weighed these impossible options, movement in the garden below caught his eye. A small figure had ducked under the barrier tape and was hobbling determinedly toward the house, ignoring the shouts from officers trying to maintain the safety perimeter. Mrs. Parker, her emergency blanket still clutched around her shoulders, had somehow slipped away from the paramedics. She was staring up at the house, her aged face illuminated by the fire's glow. When she spotted Mike on the balcony, she froze momentarily, then began waving frantically and shouting something he couldn't make out over the din. Mike leaned forward as far as he dared, straining to hear the elderly woman's words. Her voice was faint, carried away by the wind and the roar of the flames, but something in her gestures suggested she wasn't simply crying out in distress. She was trying to tell him something specific. Mrs. Parker pointed repeatedly at the house, then made a strange motion with her hands, first flat together, then opening like a book. She kept shouting the same phrase over and over, her expression desperate for him to understand. Mike shook his head, pointing to his ear to indicate he couldn't hear her. In response, Mrs. Parker's motions became more emphatic. She mimed opening something again, then pointed to the ground and made a digging motion. The firefighters had noticed her now and were moving to escort her back behind the safety line. Mrs. Parker fought against them with surprising strength for her age, continuing to shout up at Mike while making those strange gestures. As the officers finally pulled her away, Mike caught a fragment of what might have been cabinet or passage, followed by what sounded like basement. Her final gesture before being led away was pointing downward insistently. When Mike perceived the elderly woman in the garden below, having circled around the security perimeter, shouting words he could barely hear about a secret path, he felt the first flicker of hope return. Mike strained to focus on Mrs. Parker's distant shouts, trying to make sense of her desperate gestures amid the roaring flames. Her words were mostly swallowed by the crackling inferno, but fragments reached him, cabinet and basement, standing out among the chaos. Her insistent pointing downward lingered in his mind as the officers finally pulled her away from the danger zone. Cabinet, passage, basement, Mike muttered, piecing together the fragmented message. Could there be another way out? Old Victorian homes like this often had quirks in their architecture. Servant stairs, dumbwaiters, maintenance passages that didn't appear on modern floor plans. A particularly violent shudder ran through the house, reminding him of the rapidly deteriorating situation. Buddy lay motionless in his arms, the small dog's breathing so shallow it was barely detectable. The terrier's eyes remained closed, his usually vibrant body limp against Mike's protective gear. "Hang on, little guy," Mike whispered, giving Buddy another brief moment with the oxygen mask before taking a shallow breath himself. The air inside the mask was hot and tainted, the filter approaching its limits. With renewed determination, Mike ducked back into the master bedroom. The fire had advanced further, consuming the vintage furniture and climbing the wallpaper. The bed had become a pyre, and portions of the ceiling hung precariously, threatening to fall at any moment. He scanned the room with new purpose, looking beyond the obvious furniture to the walls themselves. Could there be a hidden door, a concealed passage? Mrs. Parker's desperation suggested she knew something about this house that might save them both. "Cabinet," Mike repeated, examining the wall opposite the bed where built-in cabinetry stretched from floor to ceiling. Most of it was already engulfed in flames, but a large oak wardrobe in the corner remained relatively untouched, protected by its position away from the heart of the blaze. The massive piece looked immovable, anchored to the floor and possibly the wall behind it. Unlike modern furniture, this was solid hardwood, built in an era when craftsmanship valued permanence above all else. The house gave another ominous groan, a deep structural sound that Mike had learned to fear throughout his career. The remaining supporting beams were failing. They had minutes at most. With Buddy tucked securely inside his jacket, Mike approached the wardrobe, examining its edges. No obvious hinges or handles suggested it concealed anything beyond storage space, but something about Mrs. Parker's certainty compelled him to investigate. He ran his gloved hands along the ornate molding, feeling for anything unusual. Near the bottom right corner, his fingers detected a slight depression, an irregularity in the otherwise perfect craftsmanship. Pressing firmly, he felt something give way with a click barely audible above the fire's roar. The entire right side of the wardrobe shifted slightly, revealing a narrow gap between it and the wall. Mike wedged his shoulder into the opening and pushed with his remaining strength. The wardrobe pivoted on hidden hinges, exposing a small maintenance door built flush with the wall behind. "You clever old house," Mike breathed, a surge of hope renewing his energy. The door was small, perhaps 3 feet high by 2 feet wide, a service access point never meant for regular use. Without hesitation, Mike dropped to his knees and twisted the simple metal latch. The door swung inward, revealing a narrow, dust-filled passage descending steeply into darkness. A violent tremor shook the room, and a massive section of ceiling collapsed mere feet, from where Mike knelt. The bed disappeared beneath flaming debris, and the heat intensified to nearly unbearable levels. There was no time left for consideration. Mike plunged into the passage headfirst, pulling the small door closed behind him. The sudden relative quiet was almost as shocking as the temperature drop. Though far from cool, the air in the narrow shaft contained less smoke, filtered somewhat by the house's internal walls. The passage was barely wide enough for Mike's shoulders, forcing him to crawl awkwardly while protecting Buddy against his chest. The steep descent was challenging, with ancient wooden steps built for maintenance access rather than comfortable travel. His injured shoulder screamed in protest with each movement. "Almost there, Buddy," Mike encouraged, though whether he was addressing the dog or himself remained unclear. The passage twisted as it descended, following the hidden structural skeleton of the house. After what felt like an eternity of painful crawling, the narrow channel opened slightly into what appeared to be a junction point between floors. A small platform, perhaps once used by maintenance workers to access different parts of the house's internal systems, offered momentary respite from the confined space. Mike paused to check on Buddy, relieved to find the dog still breathing, though his condition hadn't improved. The platform contained several old boxes, presumably stored and forgotten decades ago. As Mike shifted to continue downward, his boot knocked over one of these boxes, spilling its contents across the dusty wood. Among the scattered items, a leather-bound book fell open near his hand. In the dim light filtering through cracks in the house's structure, Mike could make out handwritten pages, a diary or journal of some kind. A black and white photograph slipped from between the pages, showing two young men in military uniforms standing side by side against a desert backdrop. Despite the desperate situation, something about the image caught Mike's attention. He picked up the photograph, bringing it closer to examine the faces. The date stamp in the corner read June 1967 in faded ink. Flipping the diary open to a random page, Mike read, "Today marks 3 years since Robert Parker saved my life in that hellish ambush outside Saigon. The medics said I shouldn't have survived, but Parker carried me 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his own leg. Some debts can never be repaid." The words struck a chord deep in Mike's memory. His father, Michael Reynolds Sr., had served in Vietnam and occasionally shared carefully edited war stories during Mike's childhood. One tale he'd repeated often involved carrying a wounded comrade to safety during an ambush, a story that had partly inspired Mike's own career as a first responder. Could it be possible? Had his father and Mrs. Parker's husband known each other? Had his father been the one who... A thunderous crash from above cut short his speculation. The passage behind him collapsed in a shower of dust and debris, the aging structure finally surrendering to the fire's assault. The way back was now completely sealed. "No time," Mike muttered, tucking the photograph into his pocket out of some instinctive respect for its history. He continued his descent with renewed urgency, the passage growing slightly wider as it approached what he hoped was the basement level. The air quality improved marginally the further down they traveled, though smoke continued to seep through the internal walls of the passage. After another 20 feet of difficult crawling, the tunnel leveled out and terminated at another small door. Mike pushed against it, finding resistance. Something heavy blocked the exit from the other side. Shifting Buddy to a more secure position, he braced himself against the opposite wall of the passage and kicked at the door with both feet. The barrier gave way with a splintering crack, sending whatever had been blocking it skittering across the floor beyond. Mike emerged into what appeared to be the home's basement, a large, stone-walled room filled with decades of accumulated belongings. Unlike the upper floors, the basement remained relatively untouched by the fire itself, though smoke had begun to fill the space from the ceiling down. The stone foundation and earth surrounding the basement provided temporary insulation from the inferno above, but Mike knew it was only a matter of time before this final refuge became just as deadly. He scanned the dimly lit space, searching for an exit. A coal chute, perhaps, or exterior cellar doors that might lead to salvation. The basement stretched the length of the house, divided by stone support columns and filled with furnishings covered in dusty sheets. Buddy stirred weakly in Mike's arms, a small cough racking his tiny frame. The movement, however feeble, reassured Mike that they were still fighting this battle together. "We're getting closer, boy," Mike said hoarsely, his own lungs burning from smoke exposure despite the protection of his gear. Movement was becoming increasingly difficult. The combination of injuries, exhaustion, and smoke inhalation slowed Mike's progress as he navigated through the cluttered basement. Each step required conscious effort, his body beginning to shut down non-essential functions to preserve what little oxygen remained in his bloodstream. After what seemed an eternity of searching, Mike spotted a promising feature on the far wall, a set of narrow double doors set into the foundation, the kind that would typically lead up to the garden. Salvation, if they could reach it. He staggered toward the doors, hope renewing his failing strength. As he approached, however, his heart sank. The ancient wooden doors were secured with a hefty iron padlock, rusted with age, but still very much intact. Mike tried the lock, confirming his fears. Without tools, breaking it would be nearly impossible, especially in his weakened state. He looked around desperately for anything that might serve as a makeshift battering ram, but the antique furniture wouldn't provide enough force to break through the solid wooden doors. A tremendous crash from above signaled another major structural failure. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and the temperature in the basement began rising rapidly. The fire had broken through to the lowest level of the house. Mike sank to his knees before the locked doors, the last barrier between them and safety. His body had reached its limits. His muscles trembled from exertion and oxygen deprivation. Even breathing had become a conscious, painful effort. He looked down at Buddy, still cradled against his chest. The small dog wasn't moving anymore, no visible rise and fall of his rib cage. In the dim light, Mike couldn't tell if the terrier was still clinging to life or had already slipped away. "No," Mike whispered fiercely. "Not after all this. Not like this." With fingers numbed by exhaustion, he carefully laid Buddy on the floor before the locked doors. The dog looked tiny and vulnerable against the cold stone, his white and tan fur darkened with soot. Mike removed his oxygen mask entirely, no longer concerned for his own survival. With gentle movements born from decades of emergency medical training, he placed the mask over Buddy's muzzle, creating a makeshift seal with his hands. "Come on, Buddy," he pleaded, beginning to administer small rescue breaths through the apparatus. "Stay with me." Between breaths, Mike listened for any response, watching for the slightest movement. The world narrowed to this single point of focus. This small life he had risked everything to save. "Please," he whispered, continuing the rhythmic breathing assistance. His vision began to darken at the edges, his own body demanding the oxygen he was giving to the dog. In this moment of absolute desperation, Mike accepted that they might not make it out. After 30 years of saving others, his final act would be this attempt to save one small dog that meant everything to a lonely old woman. Somehow, it felt like a fitting end. As consciousness began to slip away, a tremendous bang erupted from the doors above him. Splinters of wood exploded inward as the locked doors were smashed open from the outside. Blinding daylight poured into the smoke-filled basement, and silhouetted against the brightness were the unmistakable forms of his fellow firefighters, axes in hand. Accepting that they wouldn't make it out in time, Mike used his final moments to try reviving Buddy with mouth-to-muzzle resuscitation, when suddenly the door was broken down from outside by his fellow firefighters. Strong hands pulled Mike through the broken doors into the blinding daylight. He squinted against the sudden brightness, his body limp with exhaustion, as his fellow firefighters dragged him clear of the collapsing structure. Through the haze of smoke and fatigue, Mike maintained his grip on Buddy, refusing to relinquish the small dog even as multiple rescuers supported his weight. "We've got you, Reynolds," someone said. Peterson, maybe, or Alvarez. The voices blended together as Mike stumbled forward on legs that threatened to buckle with each step. Behind them, the Victorian house groaned its death rattle. A series of crashes signaled the final collapse of the internal structure, sending a plume of embers and black smoke skyward. The timing of their escape couldn't have been measured in minutes. Only seconds had separated salvation from tragedy. Mike's consciousness wavered as they guided him away from the danger zone. The world tilted and shifted, faces appearing and disappearing in his narrowing field of vision. Only one thought kept him anchored to awareness, the small, still form cradled against his chest. "Get a medic over here," Chief Donovan's voice cut through the chaos. "Reynolds needs oxygen now." As they reached the triage area, Mike felt hands trying to separate him from Buddy. He tightened his grip instinctively, a hoarse "no" escaping his ash-coated throat. "Mike, you need treatment," Chief Donovan said, his earlier anger replaced with professional concern. "Let the paramedics help you." "The dog first," Mike managed, his voice barely audible. "Help him first." He looked down at Buddy, still motionless in his arms. The small terrier hadn't responded to his rescue breathing in the basement, showing no signs of life since they'd emerged into the daylight. Yet Mike wouldn't accept the finality of it. With trembling arms, he lowered Buddy to a waiting emergency blanket on the ground. A paramedic immediately knelt beside them, looking from the dog to Mike with uncertainty. "Sir, I'm not trained for—" "Please," Mike interrupted, dropping to his knees despite the pain that shot through his injured body. "Just try. Oxygen. Anything." The young paramedic hesitated only briefly before reaching for a pediatric oxygen mask from her kit. "I can try, but I need to get you on oxygen too, sir. Your O2 stats are critically low." Mike nodded absently, his focus entirely on Buddy as the paramedic gently fitted the small mask over the dog's muzzle. Another medic approached with an adult mask for Mike, but he waved it away, pointing insistently at Buddy. "Reynolds, that's enough," Chief Donovan said firmly, placing a heavy hand on Mike's shoulder. "You've done everything humanly possible. Let the medics take care of you now." Mike barely registered the words. Through the gathering crowd of emergency personnel, he spotted a fragile figure pushing her way forward. Mrs. Parker had evaded the officers once again, her determination carrying her through the chaos to reach the very center of the emergency response. The elderly woman's face was a mask of controlled emotion as she approached. Her eyes moved from Mike to the small form on the blanket, taking in the paramedics' futile efforts with the oxygen mask. Something in her expression hardened, a shudder falling over whatever vulnerability had been there moments before. Mike tried to stand as she approached, an ingrained respect for the elderly, momentarily overriding his physical limitations. His legs betrayed him, however, and he remained kneeling beside Buddy's still form. "Mrs. Parker," he began, the words catching in his raw throat. "I tried—" "I can see what happened," she interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady. Mrs. Parker looked down at Buddy, then back to Mike, her eyes cold despite the inferno still raging behind her. "You went back for him. Against orders, I presume." Mike nodded, unable to form words adequate for the situation. Mrs. Parker stepped closer, standing directly before him now. The paramedics paused their efforts, the gathering of firefighters falling silent. Something in the elderly woman's demeanor commanded this moment of respect, this pause amid the emergency. "You demoyed too long," she said, each word precise and cutting. "He's dead, just like everyone else I've ever loved." The words fell like physical blows. Mike stared up at her, understanding blossoming even through his oxygen-deprived mind. This wasn't just grief speaking. This was a woman who had learned to expect loss, perhaps even to armor herself against it, by accepting it before it was certain. "No," Mike said. the single word stronger than any he'd managed since the rescue. "No, we don't know that yet." Without waiting for her response, Mike gently pushed aside the paramedic and moved closer to Buddy. The small dog lay motionless on the emergency blanket, his fur matted with soot, eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. No visible breath moved his tiny ribcage. "Sir, I've tried," the paramedic said softly. "There's no response to the oxygen. I'm sorry, but we need to attend to your injuries now." Mike ignored her, positioning himself beside Buddy's small form. 30 years of emergency response had included countless hours of training in resuscitation techniques. Though typically applied to humans, the basic principles remained similar. With gentle but firm hands, Mike positioned Buddy's head, straightening his airway. Then, with a care that belied his large, calloused fingers, he began chest compressions sized appropriately for the small animal, rhythmic, measured pressure followed by release. 1, 2, 3, 4, he counted under his breath, maintaining the steady cadence despite the burning pain in his shoulders and back. After 30 compressions, he carefully sealed his mouth over Buddy's muzzle and nose, delivering a small, controlled breath. Not enough to damage the tiny lungs, but sufficient to deliver oxygen to the starved tissues. "Reynolds, you need medical attention," Chief Donovan insisted, his voice gentler now. "Let him go." "Not yet," Mike responded between compressions. "Not yet." The crowd of first responders watched in silence, the usual urgency of the scene suspended in this moment of stubborn hope. Mrs. Parker remained where she stood, her expression unreadable as she witnessed Mike's desperate efforts. Minutes passed. How many, Mike couldn't say. His world had narrowed to the rhythm of compressions and breaths, to the silent mantra repeating in his head, "Not again. Not this time. Not again." His vision began to blur, his own oxygen-starved brain protesting the continued exertion. Still, he persisted, adjusting the pressure of his compressions when they seemed too forceful for the fragile body beneath his hands. "Please," he whispered between breaths. "Come on, Buddy." Just as the darkness began to close in on Mike's peripheral vision, just as his arms threatened to give out entirely, something changed. A small twitch, so slight it might have been imagination, moved through Buddy's body. Mike paused, his hands hovering over the dog's chest. "Did you see that?" he asked no one in particular. Before anyone could respond, it happened again, a more definite movement, followed by the faintest sound, a gasp so small it was nearly inaudible. "Oxygen," Mike called hoarsely. "Get the mask back on him." The paramedic rushed forward, quickly reapplying the pediatric mask. This time, as the oxygen flowed, Buddy's chest rose and fell with a shallow but unmistakable breath. "He's breathing," the paramedic confirmed, her professional detachment slipping to reveal genuine amazement. "It's weak, but it's there." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the gathered crowd. Chief Donovan squeezed Mike's shoulder, wordlessly acknowledging what they were witnessing. Buddy's breathing gradually strengthened, each inhalation more substantial than the last. Then, in a moment, Mike knew would stay with him forever. The small dog's eyes fluttered open, confused, pained, but undeniably alive. "Mrs. Parker," Mike said, looking up at the elderly woman still standing rigid beside them. "He's alive." Something cracked in her carefully maintained expression, a hairline fracture in decades of practiced stoicism. She took a small, hesitant step forward, then another, until she stood directly over Buddy. With movements that betrayed her age, she lowered herself to the ground beside Mike and the paramedic. "Buddy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. At the sound of his name, the small dog's ears twitched slightly. His eyes, still unfocused, moved in the direction of her voice. The transformation in Mrs. Parker's face was instantaneous and profound. The hard lines of resignation melted away, replaced by an expression of such naked hope that Mike had to look away, feeling as though he was intruding on something deeply private. "You did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she turned to Mike. "You actually did it." Mike finally surrendered to the paramedics, allowing them to fit an oxygen mask over his own face as Mrs. Parker gently stroked Buddy's head with trembling fingers. The rush of clean oxygen sent a wave of dizziness through him, his body belatedly processing the trauma it had endured. As the medical team worked on him, applying burn cream to his back and shoulders and starting an IV for fluids and pain medication, Mike kept his eyes on Buddy. The small dog continued to improve, his breathing steadying, his eyes becoming more alert with each passing minute. "He'll need veterinary care," the paramedic explained to Mrs. Parker. "Smoke inhalation, possible burns to his respiratory tract. But dogs are resilient. Given his response already, I'd say his chances are good." Mrs. Parker nodded, her entire demeanor transformed. The bitterness that had etched itself into her features had softened, replaced by something that, while not quite joy, suggested the possibility of it. As they loaded both patients into separate ambulances, Mike to the hospital and Buddy to the emergency veterinary clinic, Mrs. Parker approached Mike one last time. The harsh words from earlier hung unspoken between them. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not giving up on him when I already had." Mike nodded, too exhausted for more words. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began to move, he finally surrendered to the darkness that had been threatening for so long, slipping into unconsciousness with one last thought. They had both made it out alive. Against all odds, they had both survived. 3 weeks later, Mike was still recovering in the hospital, reliving the enigmatic words Mrs. Parker had spoken about his father. Mike stared out the hospital window, his mind returning to Mrs. Parker's cryptic words about his father. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his room, highlighting the many flower arrangements from his colleagues at the fire station. 3 weeks had passed since the rescue, yet the mystery of her comment lingered, unsolved amid his physical recovery. "Your father," she had said, just before he lost consciousness in the ambulance. What could she possibly know about his father that he didn't? A nurse entered, interrupting his thoughts. She was young and cheerful, with practiced movements as she checked his vitals and examined the healing burns across his back and shoulders. "These are looking much better, Mr. Reynolds," she said, applying fresh dressings. "The doctor's very pleased with your progress." Mike nodded, wincing slightly as she touched a particularly sensitive area. The pain had diminished considerably since the first week, but certain movements still triggered sharp reminders of what his body had endured. "When can I go home?" he asked, the same question he'd been asking daily. "Soon," she replied with the same patient smile. "Maybe by the end of the week if your respiratory values continue to improve." As she worked, Mike noticed Chief Donovan standing in the doorway, a folder tucked under his arm, and a solemn expression on his face. The nurse acknowledged him with a nod before gathering her supplies. "You've got a visitor, Mr. Reynolds. I'll give you two some privacy." After she left, Donovan settled heavily into the chair beside Mike's bed. The two men had known each other for nearly 2 decades, their relationship built on mutual respect, despite occasional disagreements about protocols and procedures. "How are you feeling today, Reynolds?" Donovan asked, his gruff voice softened with genuine concern. "Better. Bored, but better," Mike replied, gesturing to the window. "Turns out, staring at the same parking lot for 3 weeks isn't as exciting as running into burning buildings." Donovan chuckled, but his expression quickly returned to seriousness. He placed the folder on the bedside table, sliding it slightly toward Mike. "Your early retirement papers," he said simply. "All filled out, just waiting for your signature." Mike eyed the folder without touching it. He'd spent 30 years dreaming of retirement, of days without danger, and nights without emergency calls. Now that it was here, thrust upon him 3 months earlier than planned, He felt strangely reluctant. The department psychologist thinks it's for the best, Donovan continued when Mike remained silent. After what happened with Frank and now this, she believes a clean break would help your recovery. Mike nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the window. The world outside seemed simultaneously inviting and intimidating. A future without the structure and purpose that had defined his adult life. I know, he said finally. I just didn't expect it to end like this. Few of us do, Donovan replied, his own retirement only a few years away. But you're going out a hero, Mike. Not many can say that. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes. Two men who had seen the best and worst of humanity together, who had pulled people from wreckage and comforted those they couldn't save. A soft knock at the door drew their attention. In the doorway stood Mrs. Parker, looking remarkably different from the last time Mike had seen her. Her silver hair was neatly styled, her clothes pressed and proper, a far cry from the distraught woman at the fire scene. And in her arms, alert and seemingly recovered, was Buddy. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said hesitantly. Not at all, Donovan replied, standing quickly. I was just dropping off some paperwork. I should get back to the station anyway. The chief nodded respectfully to Mrs. Parker as he passed, pausing briefly to scratch Buddy behind the ears. Good to see you looking so well, little fellow, he said before disappearing down the hallway. Mrs. Parker entered cautiously, as if uncertain of her welcome. Buddy, however, had no such reservations. The moment he spotted Mike, the small dog began wiggling excitedly in Mrs. Parker's arms, whining and straining toward the bed. He remembers you, Mrs. Parker said, a note of wonder in her voice. May I? Mike nodded, and she carefully placed Buddy on the edge of the hospital bed. The terrier immediately scrambled up the blankets to reach Mike, his tail wagging so vigorously his entire hindquarters shook with the effort. When he reached Mike's face, he began enthusiastically licking his chin and cheeks, eliciting the first genuine laugh Mike had experienced in weeks. Easy, Buddy, Mike chuckled, gently scratching behind the dog's ears. I'm still a bit sore. Mrs. Parker smiled, settling into the chair Donovan had vacated. The veterinarian says he's made a miraculous recovery. His lungs are clear, and aside from some minor singeing to his fur, you'd never know what he went through. Buddy finally settled down, curling up against Mike's side with a contented sigh. The weight and warmth of the small animal was oddly comforting, anchoring Mike to the present moment. I've been wanting to visit sooner, Mrs. Parker continued, her hands folded primly in her lap. But I needed to wait until I had something to bring you. Something important. She reached into a large handbag and removed a familiar leather-bound book and a small wooden box. Mike immediately recognized the diary he'd glimpsed in the passageway during their escape. You found them, he said, reaching for the items with his uninjured arm. The fire investigators recovered them from the basement after the structure was stabilized, she explained. I asked them to look specifically for these items. They're why I came to talk to you today. Mike opened the wooden box first. Inside lay the military medal he'd glimpsed briefly, along with several black and white photographs. The medal was a bronze star with a V device, indicating it had been awarded for valor in combat. This belonged to your husband? Mike asked, examining the medal with respect. Yes, Robert earned it in Vietnam, Mrs. Parker confirmed. She reached over and opened the diary to a specific page where a photograph was carefully preserved between the sheets. Mike's breath caught as he recognized the two young men in the photo. The same image he'd glimpsed momentarily in the passage, now clearly visible in the hospital's bright light. Two soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, standing before a military tent. This is my Robert, Mrs. Parker said, pointing to the taller of the two men. And this, her finger moved to the second soldier, is your father, Michael Reynolds Sr. Mike stared at the photograph, at the young face so similar to his own. His father had rarely spoken about his time in Vietnam, and when he did, the stories were carefully edited, the trauma buried beneath layers of practiced nonchalance. "How did you know he was my father?" Mike asked, unable to take his eyes off the image. Mrs. Parker turned to another page in the diary where Robert Parker's neat handwriting filled the yellowed paper. "May 17th, 1967, she read aloud. "Today marks 1 year since Reynolds saved my life. The medics said the blood loss should have killed me, but that stubborn kid refused to leave me behind, carried me 3 miles with a bullet in his own leg. Some debts can never be repaid, but I've sworn to try. His son was born last month. Michael Jr., he wrote me. Perhaps someday our families will know each other in peacetime." Mike listened in stunned silence. His birthday was April 12, 1967. The timing aligned perfectly. "My Robert and your father served in the same unit," Mrs. Parker continued, her voice softening with memory. "They were on a classified mission when their squad was ambushed. Robert was severely wounded. Your father carried him to safety, despite being injured himself." She carefully turned the pages, revealing more photographs and handwritten entries. "They stayed in touch for a few years after the war. Your father visited once when you were too young to remember, just a toddler. But then—" "The mission was classified," Mike finished, understanding dawning. "Dad never spoke about it because he couldn't." Mrs. Parker nodded. "Robert promised to keep the details secret. It was part of their assignment. Nothing about it could ever be officially acknowledged. When Robert died 15 years ago, I found all these materials in a locked box. I knew what they meant to him, but I never reached out to your family. I felt bound by the same secrecy that had constrained him." Mike ran his fingers over his father's young face in the photograph. Michael Reynolds Sr. had passed away 10 years ago from heart failure, taking whatever secrets he'd carried to his grave. "He had a medal just like this," Mike said softly. "He never explained where it came from, just said it was from a time best forgotten." Mrs. Parker reached into her bag once more and removed another identical medal. "They both received the Bronze Star for that mission," she explained. "Robert always said your father deserved the Medal of Honor for what he did that day. But because the operation was classified, this was all they could officially award." Buddy stirred against Mike's side, yawning widely before settling back into sleep. The simple, trusting movement of the small dog brought Mike back to the present moment, to the strange connection that had brought him and Mrs. Parker together after all these years. "Why didn't you tell me at the fire scene?" Mike asked gently. "When you recognized my name?" Mrs. Parker's expression clouded, her eyes dropping to her hands. "After Robert died, I shut down, closed myself off from connections, from relationships. It was easier that way," she admitted. "When the fire happened and I heard your name over the radio, I recognized it immediately. But I was afraid of what it might mean to acknowledge that connection." She looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Then when I saw you emerge from the house with Buddy, and I thought he was gone, I lashed out. I said terrible things to you. The truth is, I've cultivated bitterness as my companion for so long, I didn't know how to react when faced with hope." Mike reached across with his good arm and gently covered her hand with his own. "We all cope however we can," he said simply. "No apologies needed." Mrs. Parker smiled gratefully, wiping away a stray tear. "It seems our families were destined to be connected, Mr. Reynolds. First through our fathers, and now through this little miracle." She nodded toward the sleeping Buddy. "Mike," he corrected. "Please call me Mike." She nodded, her smile widening slightly. "Eleanor," she offered in return. As their conversation continued, Eleanor sharing stories about Robert that filled in gaps in Mike's understanding of his own father's history, Buddy slept peacefully between them, his presence a living bridge connecting their shared past to a possible future. When the time came for Eleanor to leave, she hesitated, reaching into her bag one final time. She produced a document, extending it toward Mike with a slightly trembling hand. "Perhaps it's not too late for both of us, Mike," she said, her voice soft but determined. "Would you help me care for Buddy when you leave this place? I think he's already chosen his second home." Mike stared at the partial adoption document in his hands, an unexpected lump forming in his throat. The official letterhead and legal language seemed to materialize something he hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment, a connection that had been forged in fire and somehow transformed into something healing. He started, then paused, unsure what to say. Eleanor waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. "I'd be honored," he finally managed, his voice rougher than he intended. Eleanor's face softened with relief. "Buddy seems to have made the decision for us both," she said, watching as the terrier snored softly against Mike's side. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse announcing the end of visiting hours. After making arrangements to visit again, Eleanor gently collected the sleeping Buddy, who whimpered briefly at being separated from Mike before settling back into her arms. After they left, Mike found himself alone with his thoughts and the collection of photographs and memorabilia that connected his father to Robert Parker. The coincidence, or fate, of their paths crossing after all these years weighed on his mind as he drifted to sleep. The following morning brought Mike's first physical therapy session. The therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Gloria, didn't spare him any discomfort as she worked on restoring mobility to his injured shoulder. "Breathe through it," she instructed, carefully manipulating his arm through its range of motion. "The longer you baby it, the longer the recovery." Mike gritted his teeth against the burning sensation. "Got it," he managed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's cool temperature. "You firefighters are all the same," Gloria remarked, easing his arm back down. "Rush into burning buildings without a second thought, then act like children at the first physical therapy session." "Just trying to live up to the stereotype," Mike replied with a strained smile. As Gloria continued working, Mike's mind drifted back to the day he lost Frank. The memory, usually kept carefully contained, now surged forward with unexpected clarity, perhaps triggered by his recent brush with a similar fate. He saw it all again. The Westridge apartment complex engulfed in flames, reports of residents still trapped inside. He and Frank had been first through the door, working methodically up to the third floor. The smoke had been thick, visibility near zero. Then the cry of a child from one direction, and Frank spotting movement in another. "I've got this one, Mike! Check the bedroom for the kid!" Frank had shouted. Mike had found the little girl, no more than 4 years old, hiding in a closet. As he carried her toward the exit, the building had groaned, that unmistakable sound of structural failure. He'd had just enough time to radio a warning to Frank. "Get out now, it's coming down!" Frank's response had been typical. 2 minutes, I've almost got him." But there hadn't been 2 minutes. The ceiling had collapsed, cutting off the hallway between them. Mike, with the child in his arms, had been forced to retreat to the window where the ladder crew evacuated them both. By the time they'd managed to reach Frank's position, it had been too late. "Mr. Reynolds, are you with me?" Gloria's voice pulled him back to the present. She was watching him with professional concern. "Your breathing changed. Are you in pain?" "Just remembering something," Mike admitted. Gloria nodded, recognizing the distant look in his eyes. She'd worked with enough first responders to know when they were revisiting old traumas. "That's enough for today," she said, helping him back into his wheelchair. "Same time tomorrow." Later that afternoon, Eleanor returned with Buddy, who bounded onto Mike's bed the moment she set him down, circling excitedly before settling against Mike's side. The small dog's enthusiasm brought smiles from the hospital staff who passed by the open door. "He's been restless all morning," Eleanor explained, taking the visitor's chair. "I think he was eager to see you." Mike scratched behind Buddy's ears. earning a contented sigh from the terrier. "The feeling's mutual, buddy." There was an ease between them now that hadn't existed before, as if sharing the story of their fathers had broken down some invisible barrier. Eleanor produced more photographs from her handbag, filling in details about Robert's life after the war, while Mike shared what little he knew of his father's military service. "Dad never talked much about Vietnam," Mike explained. "When he did, it was always the same few sanitized stories. Nothing about secret missions or saving anyone's life." Eleanor nodded in understanding. Robert was the same way. The diary was his private outlet. He never discussed those experiences aloud, not even with me. As they continued talking, Mike found himself opening up about Frank. The words came unexpectedly, spilling out after years of careful containment. "I couldn't save him," Mike admitted, his voice low. "That's why I had to go back for Buddy. I couldn't face losing someone else when there was even a chance of saving them." Eleanor listened silently, her weathered hand finding Mike's forearm in a gesture of quiet support. "For years, I've wondered if I made the right choice," Mike continued, "taking the child to safety instead of trying to reach Frank. The rational part of me knows there was no other option, but the heart doesn't always follow rational paths," Eleanor finished for him. She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "After my son died, this was before I even met Robert, I spent years blaming myself for not recognizing the symptoms sooner." Mike looked up in surprise. Eleanor hadn't mentioned a son before. "Leukemia," she explained, reading his expression. "He was only 7. For decades, I cultivated that guilt like it was a virtue, as if punishing myself somehow honored his memory." Her honesty was disarming, creating space for Mike to examine his own grief with new perspective. "How did you move past it?" he asked. Eleanor laughed softly, the sound carrying a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. "Who says I have? But I've learned to make room for it, to let it exist without letting it define every moment." She gestured to Buddy, who was watching their conversation with alert, intelligent eyes. "And sometimes life forces new beginnings on us when we're too stubborn to seek them ourselves." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Chief Donovan entered, carrying a manila folder and looking slightly uncomfortable in the hospital environment. "Mrs. Parker," he acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Good to see you again." "Please, call me Eleanor," she replied warmly. Donovan turned to Mike. "Just wanted to give you an update on the investigation. It's official. You've been cleared of any procedural violations." He handed Mike the folder. "The report concludes your actions were heroic, if unorthodox. The department is actually using your rescue as a case study for our training program." Mike accepted the folder with mixed emotions. Being celebrated for breaking protocol felt strangely hollow. "Thanks, Chief. That's good to hear." Donovan cleared his throat. "There's something else. Given the exceptional circumstances, the department is organizing a special commendation for your retirement ceremony." Eleanor brightened at this news. "A ceremony? When will it be?" "As soon as our hero here is discharged," Donovan replied, a rare smile crossing his usually stern face. "Assuming he's up for it." As they discussed the details, Buddy suddenly perked up, his attention drawn to the window. The small dog trotted across Mike's bed to the windowsill, his nose pressed against the glass as he watched something outside with intense concentration. "What is it, boy?" Mike asked, following the dog's gaze to where a nurse was tending to flowering plants in the small garden visible from his window. "He's probably never seen a hospital garden before," Eleanor remarked. "Everything must seem new and fascinating after his ordeal." Her casual observation struck Mike unexpectedly. Everything new after an ordeal. Wasn't that true for him as well? For both of them? The world outside his window suddenly seemed different than it had that morning, filled with possibilities rather than challenges. Later, After both visitors had left, Mike found himself alone again, watching the lengthening shadows across his room. His discharge was tentatively scheduled for the end of the week, and for the first time since the fire, he found himself looking forward rather than backward. The nurse who came to check his vitals commented on his improved mood. "You seem better today, Mr. Reynolds, more present." "I think I am," Mike replied, surprising himself with the realization. The next morning, Eleanor arrived with another surprise, a small potted plant with delicate white flowers. "To replace the one you saved from my garden," she explained, placing it on his windowsill. Buddy, who had accompanied her again, immediately inspected the new addition to the room before returning to his now customary spot beside Mike. They spent the morning poring over the album of wartime photographs, Eleanor filling in missing pieces of the story that connected their families. Some pages contained letters between Robert and Michael Sr., discussing everyday life and their adjustments to civilian existence after the war. They were planning a fishing trip, Eleanor noted, pointing to a letter dated 1974. But then, Robert's security clearance came up for renewal, and they decided it was safer to maintain distance. Mike shook his head at the irony. "All these years, our families connected by a secret neither of us knew about." As lunchtime approached, Eleanor gathered her things to leave, promising to return the following day. Mike watched her fuss over Buddy's leash, struck by how quickly this woman had transformed from a stranger to someone he genuinely cared about. Before she reached the door, Mike called out, "Eleanor, wait." She turned, eyebrows raised in question. "There's somewhere I need to go before I move forward," Mike said, the decision crystallizing even as he spoke the words. "And I'd like you and Buddy to come with me." Mike leaned on his walking cane, guiding Eleanor and Buddy through the neat rows of headstones at Municipal Cemetery. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the meticulously maintained grounds, where American flags marked the graves of veterans and fallen first responders. Despite the warmth of the day, Mike felt a chill as they approached the firefighters section. His doctor had been reluctant to discharge him for this outing, agreeing only after Mike insisted it was necessary for his emotional recovery. Now, with each careful step along the paved pathway, he felt the weight of what lay ahead growing heavier. "It's been 5 years," Mike said quietly. 5 years since I visited him." Eleanor nodded, understanding filling her eyes. Buddy walked beside them with unusual solemnity, his normally energetic demeanor subdued, as if sensing the gravity of their purpose. The small terrier stayed close to Mike's side, occasionally looking up at him with attentive brown eyes. "After the funeral, I came every week," Mike continued, his voice growing rougher. "Then every month. Then it just became too hard. The last time was his birthday, 3 years ago." They moved past a section of older graves, weathered stones marking the final resting places of firefighters from decades past. Mike's steps slowed as they approached a newer area, where polished granite reflected the sunlight. "There," Mike said, pointing with his cane to a headstone near a small oak tree. The grave marker was simple but dignified. "Frank Martinez, 1968-2018, hero until the end." A small bronze plaque depicting a firefighter's helmet decorated the top of the stone. Mike stopped a few feet from the grave, his breath catching in his throat. The physical pain from his injuries seemed to fade compared to the emotional weight that pressed down on his chest. "Would you like a moment alone?" Eleanor asked gently, touching his arm. Mike nodded, grateful for her perceptiveness. "Just a few minutes." Eleanor took Buddy's leash and retreated to a bench about 30 yards away, giving Mike his privacy while remaining within sight. The elderly woman settled on the bench, speaking quietly to Buddy, who sat attentively at her feet. Mike approached Frank's grave slowly, each step deliberate. When he reached the headstone, he lowered himself painfully to one knee, resting his hand on the warm granite. "Hey, partner," he said softly. "It's been a while." The cemetery remained quiet around him, only distant bird song and the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. "I nearly joined you last month," Mike continued, tracing Frank's name with his fingertip. "Went back into a burning building against orders. Sound familiar?" A sad smile crossed his face as he remembered the countless times Frank had taken similar risks during their years working together. It was for a dog this time, a little terrier named Buddy. Mike glanced over his shoulder to where Buddy sat beside Eleanor. "I couldn't save you, but I managed to save him. Not sure if that balances the scales, but..." His voice trailed off as emotion tightened his throat. 5 years of avoided conversations, of unspoken guilt and grief, seemed to press against him all at once. "I've been angry for so long," Mike admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "At you for going back in that day. At myself for not finding a way to reach you. At the whole damn world for continuing to spin when you weren't in it anymore." Tears began rolling down his weathered cheeks, but Mike made no move to wipe them away. "But something's changed, Frank. Meeting Eleanor, saving Buddy. It's like I can finally see past that day. Like I'm allowed to have a future that isn't defined by losing you." Mike fell silent for a long moment, watching a butterfly land briefly on top of the headstone before fluttering away. "I couldn't bring you back," he said finally, "but I'm starting to think that maybe I can carry you forward instead." The simple declaration felt right, as if speaking the words had released something that had been tightly bound within him for years. Mike remained kneeling for several more minutes, sometimes speaking softly about Eleanor and Buddy, sometimes simply quiet in the presence of his friend. When he finally stood, his knees protesting the movement, he felt lighter somehow. Not healed. He understood now that some wounds never fully close, but perhaps finally beginning to scar over. He made his way back to Eleanor, who looked up at his approach with gentle understanding in her eyes. "Thank you for waiting," Mike said. "There's someone else I'd like to visit while we're here, if you're willing." Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt. "Robert's grave?" Mike nodded. "I thought, well, it seemed right somehow." "I'd like that," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but steady. "I haven't visited in some time myself." They walked together to another section of the cemetery, where Robert Parker's grave lay beneath a spreading maple tree. The headstone was elegant but understated, much like the man Eleanor had described in her stories. A small military medallion was embedded in the granite, marking him as a Vietnam veteran. "He would have been 82 this year," Eleanor said as they approached. "Sometimes I still expect to hear him calling from his study, asking where I've put his reading glasses." Mike stood respectfully a few steps back as Eleanor approached the grave. Unlike his own emotional reunion with Frank's memory, Eleanor's visit seemed more measured, the rituals of grief long established by years of practice. She spoke quietly to her husband's grave, her words too low for Mike to hear. Buddy sat between them, looking from Eleanor to Mike and back again, his expressive eyes seemingly understanding the emotional significance of these visits. After a few minutes, Eleanor beckoned Mike forward. "Tell him about your father," she suggested. "I think he would have liked, that." Mike moved closer, standing beside Eleanor before the headstone. He felt strangely self-conscious at first, speaking to a man he had never met, yet who was connected to his own father through bonds of war and sacrifice. "My father never talked much about Vietnam," Mike began awkwardly. "But I know now that you were an important part of his life. I wish I could have heard the story from him, but I'm grateful to learn it now, through Eleanor." As he continued speaking, sharing brief anecdotes about his father that his mother had told him after his father's death, Mike's initial discomfort faded. There was something healing in connecting these fragmented pieces of family history, in acknowledging the invisible threads that had drawn them all together. Eleanor removed a small object from her pocket, a replica of the bronze star medal that both Robert and Mike's father had received. With careful movements, she placed it at the base of the headstone. "He always said your father deserved higher recognition," she explained, her fingers lingering on the medal. "This is my way of acknowledging that debt." They stood together in companionable silence, united by loss, yet somehow strengthened by the shared experience of it. Buddy remained between them, a living bridge connecting their separate griefs. Mike found himself looking between the two graves they had visited. Frank's in the Firefighter section, Robert's here among other veterans. Different lives, different deaths, yet both men had shaped the people standing before their memorials today. "Ready to go?" Mike asked gently after several minutes had passed. Eleanor nodded, taking a deep breath as if gathering strength. "Yes. It's time to rejoin the living, I think." As they turned to leave, Mike offered his arm to Eleanor, who accepted it with a grateful smile. They walked slowly along the cemetery path, their steps falling into a natural rhythm, despite their differences in age and physical condition. "Thank you for bringing me here," Eleanor said as they approached the cemetery gates. "It's been too long since I visited Robert properly." "Thank you for coming with me," Mike replied. "I don't think I could have faced Frank alone." The admission cost him something in pride, but gained him far more in genuine connection. Eleanor squeezed his arm lightly in acknowledgement. "Perhaps that's what we both needed," she suggested. "Someone to stand beside us while we faced our pasts." As they reached the cemetery entrance, Buddy suddenly stopped walking. The small dog turned his head, looking back toward the graves they had visited with unusual intensity. His ears perked forward, his body completely still except for his nose, which twitched as if catching an unfamiliar scent. "Buddy," Eleanor called, concerned by the dog's strange behavior. The terrier didn't respond, continuing to stare toward the distant headstones. Then, to both their surprise, he let out a single clear bark, not his usual excited yap or warning growl, but something that seemed almost respectful. "What is it, boy?" Mike asked, following the dog's gaze. "Do you see something?" The cemetery appeared empty to human eyes, just rows of stones stretching across the carefully maintained lawn. Yet Buddy continued to stare, his attention fixed on something neither Mike nor Eleanor could perceive. "They say animals can sense things we can't," Eleanor said softly, a slight tremor in her voice. Mike nodded, a strange chill running down his spine despite the warm day. "Do you think he's seeing—" He couldn't quite finish the sentence, the implications too profound to voice aloud. Yet some part of him wondered if Buddy's perception extended beyond the physical world they inhabited. After another moment, Buddy finally turned away from whatever had captured his attention, trotting back to Mike and Eleanor with his normal, cheerful demeanor restored. The transition was so abrupt that they might have questioned whether the strange moment had happened at all, if not for the shared experience of witnessing it. As they left the cemetery behind and made their way to Eleanor's waiting car, Buddy looked back once more and gave a single tail wag, as if saying goodbye to someone only he could see. Mike stood before the mirror in his apartment, adjusting the collar of his dress uniform. The gold buttons and badges gleamed under the bedroom light, a stark contrast to the still-healing pink skin visible at his neck. 3 decades of service were represented in the various pins and medals adorning his chest, each with its own story of triumph or tragedy. He ran his fingers over the nameplate, Reynolds, feeling a strange disconnect. For 30 years, this uniform had been his identity. In 2 days, at the retirement ceremony, he would wear it for the last time. "What now, Reynolds?" he asked his reflection, echoing the question his therapist had posed earlier that week. The phone's shrill ring interrupted his thoughts. Crossing to the nightstand, he glanced at the caller ID before answering. "Eleanor, everything all right?" "It's Buddy," she replied, her voice tense. He's been pacing and whining all morning. I can't seem to calm him down." Mike checked his watch. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Since their visit to the cemetery 3 days ago, Mike had noticed a change in Eleanor, a subtle softening of her demeanor, as if some tightly wound spring within her had finally relaxed. Buddy, however, seemed to have developed new anxieties. When Mike arrived at Eleanor's temporary accommodations, a small rental house while contractors assessed the fire damage to her Victorian home, Buddy greeted him with frantic enthusiasm. The small terrier circled his legs, whining and jumping, until Mike knelt to greet him properly. "Hey, Buddy," he said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "What's got you so worked up today?" Eleanor appeared in the doorway, looking tired but relieved to see him. "He's been like this since we returned to the property yesterday to collect more salvageable items." Mike straightened up, wincing slightly as his still-healing back protested. "You went back to the house? You should have called me." "The fire investigators said it was safe for a brief visit," she explained, leading him into the small living room where cardboard boxes contained the remnants of her previous life. "The structural engineer needs to complete his assessment before they determine if it can be rebuilt or must be demolished." Buddy refused to settle, pacing between them and the door, occasionally pausing to bark anxiously. "He wouldn't go inside," Eleanor continued, watching the dog with concern. "He just stood at the edge of the property, barking at the house. The inspector said animals often remember trauma associated with specific locations." Mike nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense. Their memories are strongly tied to scents. He probably still smells the smoke and associates it with pain and fear." He followed Buddy to the window, where the terrier stood with his front paws on the sill, staring intently outside. "Has he been doing this a lot? Fixating on windows and doors?" Eleanor sighed. "Constantly. It's as if he's anticipating something, or someone." Mike watched Buddy's alert posture, remembering the dog's strange behavior at the cemetery. "Maybe he's still adjusting to everything that happened. We all are in our own ways." Eleanor gestured toward the kitchen. "Tea? I was just about to make some." As she busied herself with the kettle, Mike examined the collection of saved items spread across the dining table. Photos in scorched frames, silverware blackened with soot, a few books with singed edges, the diminished inventory of a lifetime. "I keep asking myself what matters," Eleanor said, noticing his attention. "What's worth saving versus what I should just let go?" "And?" Mike prompted gently. "And I'm finding the answer isn't in these things at all." She placed 2 cups on the table. "I've been looking at retirement communities." Mike raised an eyebrow in surprise. "That's a big change." Eleanor slid a glossy brochure toward him. "Oakwood Gardens. It's a senior living community about 15 minutes from here." She hesitated, then added, "2 blocks from your apartment, actually." Mike examined the brochure, featuring smiling seniors in a well-maintained garden setting. "Looks nice. You're serious about this?" "I called yesterday," Eleanor confirmed. "They have a 2-bedroom unit available next month. They allow pets," she added, glancing at Buddy, who had temporarily abandoned his post at the window to sit between them. "What about your house? All the memories there?" Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. "That's what kept me there all these years. Memories. But after the fire..." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I realized I've been living in a museum to my past. Maybe it's time to create some new memories instead." Mike nodded, understanding completely. His own apartment had become something similar after Frank's death, a place where time seemed suspended, where moving forward felt like betrayal. "Change is terrifying," he admitted, "but sometimes necessary." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Buddy immediately sprang to attention, barking excitedly. Eleanor opened the door to reveal Chief Donovan, looking uncharacteristically casual in jeans and a department polo shirt. "Mrs. Parker," he greeted her politely. "I hope I'm not interrupting." I stopped by Mike's place and his neighbor said he might be here. Please, come in, Eleanor replied. And it's Eleanor, remember? Donovan nodded, stepping inside. Eleanor, then. He acknowledged Mike with a nod. Reynolds, got a minute? They moved to the living room, where Donovan declined Eleanor's offer of tea. Buddy approached the chief cautiously, sniffing his boots before apparently deciding he was acceptable company. The guys wanted me to check how you're doing with the ceremony preparations, Donovan began. Thompson's handling most of it, but they wanted to know if you'd prepared remarks. Mike grimaced. Still working on it. The truth was he hadn't written a word. How could he summarize 30 years of service in a brief speech? Well, don't stress too much. These things are usually more about the food and drink anyway, Donovan said with uncharacteristic lightness. He glanced around at the boxes. Moving preparations? Eleanor explained her decision to sell the house and relocate to Oakwood Gardens. As she spoke, Mike noticed the chief's expression shift from polite interest to something more calculating. Selling the house outright? Donovan asked. Or working with the insurance first? Both, I suppose, Eleanor replied. The insurance adjuster has already assessed the damage. Once I know whether it's a rebuild or demolition, I'll list it with a realtor. You know, Donovan said carefully, several of the guys from the station have experience with construction and renovation. If you need help with anything before the sale... Mike raised an eyebrow at the chief, who shrugged. The department takes care of its own, Reynolds. And Mrs. Parker, Eleanor, is part of that now. The simple declaration clearly touched Eleanor, who blinked rapidly before responding. That's extraordinarily kind, Chief Donovan. Jim, he corrected with a small smile. And it's nothing. The guys have been asking how they could help since they heard about your connection to Mike's father. The conversation shifted to practical matters, which firefighters had which skills, when they might be available, what Eleanor needed most assistance with. Throughout the discussion, Mike observed the subtle change in Eleanor's demeanor, the way she gradually relaxed into accepting help rather than maintaining her usual self-sufficient stance. When Donovan eventually left, promising to coordinate volunteer efforts through Mike, an easy silence settled between them. Buddy had finally calmed down, curling contentedly on the couch between them. Your colleagues are good people, Eleanor said finally. The best, Mike agreed. Though I'm a bit surprised by Donovan. He's not usually so personable. Eleanor smiled. Perhaps he, like me, is discovering it's never too late to change. They spent the afternoon sorting through more of Eleanor's salvaged belongings, separating items into piles for keeping, donating, or discarding. As they worked, Eleanor shared stories behind various objects. The chipped teacup from her honeymoon, the tarnished letter opener that had belonged to Robert's father, the faded concert program from the night they had met. What will you do? Eleanor asked as they took a break, watching Buddy explore the small backyard through the kitchen window. After retirement, I mean. Mike had been asked this question countless times in recent months, usually offering vague platitudes about fishing or traveling. This time, however, he found himself sharing a more concrete idea. I've been thinking about therapy dogs, he said. The hospital had one that visited while I was recovering, a golden retriever named Max. The difference he made for the patients was remarkable. Eleanor's eyes lit up. You mean working with Buddy? He'd need training, certification, Mike explained. But he's got the right temperament. Friendly, responsive, intuitive. And after what he's been through, he might connect especially well with trauma survivors. The idea had been forming gradually in Mike's mind, a way to continue serving others while also processing his own experiences. Seeing Eleanor's enthusiastic response confirmed it might be worth pursuing. We could do it together, he suggested. If you're interested, share the training responsibilities. I'd like that, Eleanor replied softly. Very much. As evening approached, Mike prepared to leave, promising to return the following day to help Eleanor with more sorting. Show the door. She hesitated, then asked, "Will you be all right? Tomorrow's your last shift at the station, isn't it?" Mike nodded, a complex mixture of emotions rising at the reminder. "Just a desk day, finishing paperwork, nothing dramatic." "Still," Eleanor said, "endings are difficult even when they're expected." "I'll be fine," Mike assured her, more confidently than he felt. "I've had months to prepare for this." As he drove home, however, Mike wondered if anyone could truly prepare for the conclusion of such a significant chapter in their life. 30 years of identity bound up in a profession that demanded everything. How did one simply walk away from that? At home, he found himself examining the objects that defined his own space. The photographs of his firefighting crew through the years, the commendations framed on the wall, the helmet from his first decade of service displayed on a shelf. Like Eleanor, he had created a museum to his past. Perhaps it was time for both of them to embrace something new. "You know what would be funny, Mike?" Eleanor had said as she stroked Buddy's fur while he prepared to leave. "If, at my age, I ended up having a new beginning, thanks to a fire that almost took everything from me." Mike studied his reflection once more as he adjusted the formal dress uniform for the retirement ceremony. Eleanor's words from the previous evening echoed in his mind. About new beginnings, born from catastrophic endings. The perfectly pressed fabric felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, a second skin he was about to shed permanently. He traced his fingers over the collection of badges and commendations adorning his chest, each one a story, a memory, a life touched or saved. The most recent addition was a special citation for the rescue of Buddy, hastily approved for today's ceremony. His phone buzzed with a message from Thompson. "Everything's ready at the station. Take your time, but don't be late to your own retirement party." Mike smiled. Thompson had been coordinating the event with surprising enthusiasm, sworn to secrecy about several special surprises that apparently awaited. One last look in the mirror. The reflection showed a man marked by time and experience, silver threading through his hair, lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, and the still healing pink skin at his neck from the burns. 30 years of service written across his face. "It's just a ceremony," he told himself. "Just a formality." But they both knew it was far more than that. As Mike gathered his keys and wallet, his doorbell rang. Opening the front door revealed Eleanor, elegantly dressed in a navy blue suit, her silver hair styled more formally than usual. Buddy sat obediently at her feet, wearing what appeared to be a miniature bow tie attached to his collar. "We thought you might like company for the drive," Eleanor explained with a slight smile. "I would, actually," Mike admitted, surprised by how relieved he felt at their presence. "Though I'm not sure they'll let Buddy in." "Oh, I've already cleared it with your Chief Donovan," Eleanor replied with a mischievous glint in her eye. "He seems quite unable to say no to an elderly woman with a sad story." Mike laughed. "You've got him figured out already." The drive to the station passed quickly, filled with Eleanor's light conversation that carefully avoided mentioning the significance of the day. Mike was grateful for the distraction, for the way she sensed his growing tension without drawing attention to it. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Mike was surprised by the number of vehicles present. "Looks like quite a turnout," he remarked, a flutter of nervousness rising in his chest. "You've touched many lives in 30 years, Eleanor said simply. The station had been transformed for the occasion. Red and white bunting decorated the bay doors, and a large banner reading, "Thank you for 30 years of service, Reynolds," stretched across the front. Firefighters, in dress uniforms, mingled with city officials and family members in the unusually festive atmosphere. As Mike stepped from the car, Thompson spotted him immediately and hurried over. "There he is," he called, drawing attention from the gathered crowd. A spontaneous round of applause erupted, causing Mike to flush with embarrassment. "You're late," Thompson grinned, clapping him on the shoulder before noticing Eleanor and Buddy. Mrs. Parker, glad you could make it. And looking very dapper, Buddy. Buddy's tail wagged at the acknowledgement as they made their way through the crowd. Mike found himself stopped every few steps by well-wishers, retired colleagues, current team members, even families of people he'd rescued over the years. Remember that apartment fire in '09? You carried my daughter out, one man said, pumping Mike's hand enthusiastically. She's graduating college next month. These encounters continued as they moved toward the station's community room where the formal ceremony would take place. Each story, each grateful handshake, reinforced the reality of what his career had meant, not as abstract service, but as individual lives touched in their most desperate moments. Eleanor remained at his side, graciously introducing herself when necessary, but mostly providing quiet support through her presence. Buddy, surprisingly well-behaved amid the excitement, stayed close to them both, occasionally accepting gentle pats from admirers. Inside the community room, rows of chairs faced a small podium decorated with the department's insignia. At the front, a display table held Mike's official retirement plaque, various commendations, and photographs documenting his career from rookie to veteran firefighter. Chief Donovan approached, looking unusually formal in his dress blues. "Reynolds," he nodded, then smiled at Eleanor. "Mrs. Parker, thank you for coming. I've reserved seats for you both in the front row." "It's quite an impressive turnout," Eleanor remarked. "Biggest retirement ceremony we've had in years," Donovan confirmed. "Though I suspect Thompson may have gone overboard with the invitations." As they took their seats, Mike noticed a familiar face in the second row, Frank's widow, Maria, accompanied by their adult daughter. He hadn't seen them since the funeral, the association too painful to maintain. Maria caught his eye and gave a small, understanding smile that somehow conveyed forgiveness for the distance he'd kept. The ceremony began with traditional formality, the presentation of colors, the national anthem, introductory remarks from the mayor and fire commissioner. Mike listened with half an ear, his mind fluctuating between past and present, between memories of his first day as a probationary firefighter and the uncertainty of tomorrow as a retired civilian. When Donovan took the podium to deliver the main address, Mike forced himself to focus. "We gather today to honor a man who exemplifies the very best of what it means to be a firefighter," Donovan began, his typically gruff voice softened with genuine emotion. "Mike Reynolds has served this department and this community for 30 years with unwavering courage, exceptional skill, and profound compassion." The chief continued, recounting significant rescues and achievements from Mike's career. Some made Mike smile with recognition, others surprised him, moments he'd forgotten or never considered particularly noteworthy. "But perhaps what defines Mike Reynolds most clearly," Donovan continued, "is his final rescue last month. Against direct orders, with retirement just weeks away, Mike returned to a collapsing structure to save not a human life, but a small dog who meant everything to a bereaved widow." Eleanor reached over and squeezed Mike's hand, as all eyes turned briefly toward them. "Some might question risking a human life for an animal," Donovan acknowledged. "But those of us who know Mike understand that for him, compassion has never been calculated by species or circumstance. When someone, anyone, needs help, Mike Reynolds answers that call." The chief's words resonated through the room, and Mike felt a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with his healing injuries. "So today, we don't just present a plaque for years served," Donovan concluded. "We honor a legacy of humanity that will continue to inspire this department long after Mike hangs up his helmet." The formal presentation followed, the retirement plaque, commemorative helmet, and various tokens of appreciation from the department and city officials. Mike accepted each with appropriate words of thanks, the rituals helping him maintain composure despite the growing emotion. Then came the moment for his prepared remarks. Mike approached the podium, the speech he'd finally written the night before carefully folded in his pocket. As he faced the gathered crowd, colleagues past and present, friends, survivors, family members of those he'd saved and those he'd lost, the prepared words suddenly seemed inadequate. "I had a speech written," he began, leaving the folded paper untouched, "about duty and honor and the privilege of service." He paused, looking out at the faces watching him. "But standing here now, I realize that's not what these 30 years have truly been about." His gaze found Eleanor and Buddy in the front row, then moved to Frank's widow and daughter, to Chief Donovan, to the rookie firefighters standing at attention along the back wall. "This job is about connections," Mike continued, the words coming naturally now. "About being there at the worst moments of people's lives and sometimes, making those moments survivable. It's about carrying the weight of those we couldn't save and being carried ourselves when that weight becomes too much." He spoke of his early years, of mentors long retired or deceased, of Frank's friendship and sacrifice, of lessons learned through triumph and tragedy. The room remained silent, except for his voice, the collective breath held as he articulated what many felt, but few had expressed. "I'm told retirement is an ending," Mike said, nearing his conclusion. "But standing here today, seeing all of you, I'm beginning to think it might actually be something else entirely." He smiled at Eleanor. "Perhaps it's just the start of a different kind of service, a different way of being connected." As Mike finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. He returned to his seat, accepting handshakes and embraces along the way, feeling lighter than he had in years. As if in acknowledging the end of this chapter, he had finally granted himself permission to begin the next. What Mike didn't expect was the final presentation. As the formal ceremony concluded, Chief Donovan called him back to the podium, this time with Eleanor beside him. "We have one final presentation," Donovan announced, nodding to Thompson, who approached carrying a framed certificate. "Mrs. Eleanor Parker has requested a special arrangement that the department fully supports." Thompson handed the certificate to Donovan, who presented it to Mike with unusual formality. "This certifies the joint guardianship of Buddy Parker Reynolds," Donovan read, "to be shared between Eleanor Parker and Michael Reynolds in recognition of the bond formed through extraordinary circumstances." Mike stared at the certificate in disbelief, then at Eleanor, who smiled warmly. "He's already chosen both of us," she explained. "This just makes it official." The unexpected gesture touched something deep within Mike. This small recognition, this sharing of responsibility for the life they had both nearly lost, symbolized a new beginning neither had anticipated. As the ceremony transitioned to the informal reception, Buddy suddenly broke away from Eleanor's hold and dashed toward Mike, something clutched in his mouth. The crowd parted, laughing, as the small dog pranced proudly to Mike's feet and dropped a well-worn slipper, one that had gone missing from Mike's apartment days earlier. Mike knelt down, accepting the offering with appropriate seriousness despite the laughter around them. "I think some things just need to be rescued twice," he said, while Eleanor and his assembled fire family erupted in appreciative chuckles. Laughter filled the reception hall as Buddy proudly placed the worn slipper at Mike's feet, tail wagging with unmistakable satisfaction. Mike picked up the tattered footwear, holding it aloft like a trophy while the assembled firefighters and their families continued chuckling. "I think some things just need to be rescued twice," Mike said, scratching behind Buddy's ears as the terrier preened under the attention. Eleanor approached, a bemused expression on her face. "So that's where it went. He's been hiding it under my couch for days, guarding it like treasure." The reception following the ceremony had transformed the station's community room into a celebration of not just Mike's career, but the bonds formed through decades of shared service. Tables laden with food and drink lined the walls, while clusters of people gathered to share stories, some heroic, others humorous, all part of the tapestry of memories that defined Mike's 30 years with the department. Chief Donovan appeared at Mike's elbow, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. proper retirement requires a proper toast," he said, offering one to Mike and nodding respectfully to Eleanor. "I'll get you one as well, ma'am." "Just sparkling water for me, thank you," Eleanor replied. "I've never developed a taste for alcohol." As Donovan moved away, Mike surveyed the room. Thompson and Martinez were animatedly recounting the infamous Christmas fire of 2012 to some rookies. Frank's widow, Maria, was chatting comfortably with several of the firefighters' spouses. The mayor was shaking hands and posing for photos near the commemorative plaque. "So," Eleanor said quietly, "how does it feel, being officially retired?" Mike considered the question, rolling the champagne glass between his palms. "Strange," he admitted. "Like I'm wearing someone else's life." "That feeling passes," she assured him. "Eventually, this new reality becomes familiar too." Buddies circled their legs, occasionally accepting treats from passing well-wishers who couldn't resist his expectant gaze. The little dog had become something of a mascot for the event, his rescue story repeated and embellished with each retelling. "Reynolds!" called Thompson from across the room. "We need you to settle a dispute about the Harris Street warehouse collapse." Mike excused himself to Eleanor and made his way through the crowd, stopping frequently to accept congratulations and reminisce about shared experiences. Each conversation reinforced what had become increasingly clear throughout the day. While he was leaving the department, the connections formed there would continue. When he returned to Eleanor's side some 20 minutes later, she was deep in conversation with Maria Martinez. The two women, despite their difference in age, seemed to have formed an immediate connection. "Eleanor was just telling me about the Oakwood Gardens community," Maria explained as Mike approached. "It sounds lovely." "I move in next week," Eleanor confirmed. "The painters finish tomorrow and the movers come Monday." "Several of us are planning to help," Mike added. "The chief has organized quite the volunteer crew." Maria smiled warmly. "That's wonderful. Support makes all the difference during transitions." Her expression shifted subtly. "I wanted to thank you, Mike, for what you said about Frank in your speech. It meant a lot to hear you talk about him that way." Mike nodded, emotion threatening to surface again. "He was the best of us." "He was human," Maria corrected gently. "Brave and flawed and wonderful, just like you." She squeezed his arm. "He wouldn't want you carrying guilt all these years. I hope you know that." Before Mike could respond, they were interrupted by the clinking of glass as Chief Donovan called for attention. The room gradually quieted as all eyes turned toward him. "Before we lose ourselves entirely in celebration and storytelling," Donovan began, "there's one more announcement I'd like to make." He gestured for Mike and Eleanor to join him at the front of the room. "Mrs. Parker has something she'd like to share." Eleanor appeared momentarily startled, but composed herself quickly and moved forward. Mike followed, curiosity written across his face. "Thank you, Chief," Eleanor said as they reached Donovan's side. She turned to face the gathered crowd, her voice clear despite her evident nervousness at public speaking. "As many of you know, I lost my home in the fire last month. What you may not know is that I've decided not to rebuild." Murmurs rippled through the audience. "Instead," she continued, "I'm selling the property and donating a portion of the proceeds to establish a fund for injured firefighters and their families." This announcement was met with surprised applause. Mike looked at Eleanor with newfound admiration. She hadn't mentioned this plan to him. "The Reynolds Parker Fund," she clarified, "will provide assistance for rehabilitation costs not covered by insurance, family support during recovery periods, and specialized equipment for firefighters returning to civilian life after career-ending injuries." The applause grew louder, with several firefighters exchanging meaningful glances. Everyone in the room understood the gaps in their coverage, the financial burdens that could follow serious injury. "This is," Mike began, struggling to find words, "a way to honor both our pasts while looking toward the future," Eleanor completed his thought. Your father saved my Robert. You saved my Buddy. It seems only fitting that this connection between our families continues to save others." Chief Donovan raised his glass. "To the Reynolds-Parker Fund," he proclaimed, "and to new beginnings built on honored traditions." "To new beginnings," the room echoed, glasses raised. As the reception continued, Mike found himself drawn into conversation after conversation, each one reinforcing the reality that retirement didn't mean disconnection. Plans were made: fishing trips with Thompson, monthly lunches with the old crew, volunteer work alongside former colleagues. His life after the department was taking shape before his eyes, different, but not diminished. Eleanor, too, was building connections, chatting easily with the firefighters' families and sharing stories about Buddy's antics since his rescue. The small dog had appointed himself her official escort, staying close to her side except for occasional visits to Mike, as if checking that both his humans were present and content. As the afternoon progressed, guests gradually began to depart. Mike found himself standing near the display of career photographs with Eleanor and Buddy, studying the visual timeline of his years of service. "It's strange," he reflected, "seeing your life laid out in pictures like this." Eleanor nodded, examining a photo of a much younger Mike receiving his first commendation. "We become different people over time, yet somehow remain ourselves." "I've been wondering who I'll be now," Mike admitted, "without this uniform, this identity." "You'll still be Mike Reynolds," Eleanor said simply. "The uniform didn't make you who you are. It just gave you opportunities to reveal what was already there." Her words settled comfortably in his mind as they said their final goodbyes to the remaining guests. Chief Donovan was the last to leave, helping them carry Mike's retirement gifts to the car. "The station will always be open to you, Reynolds," Donovan said, shaking his hand firmly. "Don't be a stranger." "I won't," Mike promised. "And thank you for everything today." As they drove away from the station, Mike at the wheel, Eleanor beside him, and Buddy contentedly curled in the back seat. A comfortable silence filled the car. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road, the day's emotions settling into a gentle afterglow of completion. "Would you like to come over for dinner?" Eleanor asked as they approached her temporary residence. "Nothing fancy, but I'd enjoy the company." "I'd like that," Mike replied, realizing he had no desire to return to his empty apartment and confront the first evening of his retirement alone. Dinner was simple but satisfying. A homemade soup Eleanor had prepared that morning, crusty bread, and comfortable conversation that wandered through topics without pressure or expectation. Buddy moved between them, occasionally resting his head on one lap or the other, perfectly content with his expanded family arrangement. As twilight deepened into evening, they moved to Eleanor's small porch with cups of tea. The neighborhood settled into nighttime rhythms around them, distant voices, a car door closing, the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze. "I meant to ask earlier," Mike said. "When did you decide about the fund? It's incredibly generous." Eleanor smiled, watching Buddy explore the yard's perimeter in the fading light. "The night after our cemetery visit. I realized I've spent years clinging to things, the house, Robert's possessions, when what matters most is what we do for each other. It's a wonderful legacy," Mike said, "for both our families." "Speaking of legacy," Eleanor said, "have you given more thought to the therapy dog program? I picked up some information from the certification organization." Mike nodded, warming to the subject. "I spoke with the hospital volunteer coordinator last week. They're very interested, especially given Buddy's own story of survival." Their conversation continued, making plans for Buddy's training, for Eleanor's move to Oakwood Gardens, for this new chapter they had unexpectedly begun writing together. There was something profoundly comforting in plotting a future that included purpose and connection. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Mike found himself pausing mid-sentence, his attention caught by something above. Two particularly bright stars seemed to shine side by side in the emerging constellations, their light somehow more distinct than those surrounding them. Without conscious thought, Mike whispered, "Thank you, Frank." "Thank you, Robert." In that moment, Buddy, who had been quietly resting at their feet, suddenly lifted his head and barked once. A clear, joyful sound directed at the same point in the night sky. His tail wagged enthusiastically, as if greeting old friends, the gesture so deliberate and focused that both Mike and Eleanor fell silent, watching the small dog's earnest communication with whatever or whoever he perceived in the stars above.